Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video, which I hope will be brief, I'd like to help students in the Academy's Summa Theologica courses to understand what's meant when I ask them to identify universals in the study of the Summa. For each lesson, we study one question at a time in the Summa Theologica courses. I ask the students to identify the articles into which each question is divided. I ask the student to identify St. Thomas's answer to each of those articles. But then one of the questions I ask is for students to identify some of the universals that we find in St. Thomas's writing, and students often don't know what I mean by universal, so I'd like to make it clear. Now, first of all, let me say a couple of things. When we take up the study of the Summa Theologica, obviously as Academy students, we're not expecting or even seeking any kind of mastery of this great work. The goal of our Summa Theologica courses is to introduce students to the Summa Theologica, teach them how it's organized, what its purpose is, lead them to become familiar with the content of the Summa, and enable them moving forward to use it as a reference that they're comfortable with. You know, when they've got to write an essay or answer a question or prepare a speech or a lesson, it's always good to be able to go to the Summa Theologica and consult it as a reference, as a source for any topic in Catholic theology. And that's the goal of our Summa Theologica course. So, and again, we're not looking for every universal because that may take a very long time. We're looking to become familiar with some of the universals that we find in our reading. And why are we doing this? Well, when we consider the questions, the controversial, difficult questions that are answered in the Summa Theologica, really it's better to say are investigated in the Summa Theologica, we can learn St. Thomas's answers, and that's great. But the problem is that in our generation, we're going to face questions that St. Thomas did not answer because he wasn't asked those questions. And so to learn St. Thomas's answer to St. Thomas's questions of St. Thomas's generation is great for us, but it's not enough because we have our own questions to answer. For example, Thomas Aquinas doesn't talk much about contraception or democracy or other issues that we face today. So what we want to do as we get into the Summa Theologica is we want to learn how St. Thomas answers these questions. We want to pay attention to his approach to answering these questions. We want to learn where does he begin when he's presented with a question like the questions we see in the Summa. We want to pay attention to his method so we can learn to imitate him when the questions are different, and we can still follow the wisdom of St. Thomas even when he doesn't necessarily answer a question for us. So we want to learn about his method, and that's what we're looking for when I ask students to identify some of the universals that he uses. Now, what do I mean by universal? Well, if you study reasoning, or when you study reasoning, you're going to learn that in deductive reasoning, we start with universal statements, statements about classes of things, or absolute statements. And we then apply those universal statements to particulars, and that leads us to conclusions. So we're looking for those universals. We're looking for those first premises that St. Thomas Aquinas starts from when he is faced with a complicated question. That's what we're looking for. Okay, not just his answers, which are conclusions. We're looking for that first premise in his arguments, where he actually looks to begin reasoning, to argue and find the solution to that problem. So that's what we're on the lookout for, because that helps us to appreciate his method and to also, gather some of those universals to ourselves for use, but also just to become comfortable with his method of answering complex questions. Okay, so let's just take a look. I'll share my screen here. Bear with me as I do so. I think I can do this. Here we go. So for question 1, you can see here in lesson 1 of Summa Theologica 1, we've got the question, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. We then go down and we see that St. Thomas has divided this question into 10 different articles. And we come to the first article here, whether besides philosophy any further doctrine is required. Is anything beyond philosophy necessary to know God or to be able to fulfill our end as human beings? And we go down a bit, and most students have no problem with this, but we find St. Thomas's answer follows this phrase in italics, I answer that, and then we have St. Thomas's answer. So we're going to read this when we study these lessons, and we're going to look for the answer to the question. And you'll notice that almost all of these questions are simple questions of contraries. It's just a yes or no answer. Okay, so we're looking for the answer to the question, but then we want to look to try to find some of those universals that St. Thomas uses to answer the question. So let's just read this together, and we'll see what we find. St. Thomas says, I answer that it was necessary for man's salvation that there should be a knowledge revealed by God beside philosophical science built up by human reason. So very simply, there's the answer to the question, right? Whether any science is needed beyond philosophy. We read right there, very simply, the answer is yes, according to St. Thomas, okay? So that's the what of his answer, and that's great. We know his answer to that question. But what we want to do is dig a little deeper to understand why. How did he come to that answer? That's what we want to understand. And he gives us the reasons. He goes on to say, firstly, because man is ordained to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of reason. And here we have a universal. Notice that one of the clues is that we find the word because, which introduces a reason for something, all right? And we see man is ordained to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. So there we have one of these starting premises where the answer comes from through deductive reasoning. Man is ordained to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. And therefore, because this end of man surpasses the grasp of his reason, philosophy is not sufficient. And you can construct that syllogism, or you can draw that syllogism out from the writing of St. Thomas. So we see his answer, that it was necessary for man's salvation that there should be some science beyond philosophy. We see his answer, but we also see his reason. Because man is ordained to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of reason. So if we take that first premise, man is ordained to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. Even if we shorten it to man is ordained to God, we now have a useful starting principle that we can use to answer all kinds of questions. And that's what we're seeking when we try to answer that question and provide universals from St. Thomas's writings. Okay, so there's an example of one. Let's keep reading. He then quotes the prophet Isaiah, and there's another question in the assignments that ask, what sources does St. Thomas draw from in answering this question? So here's an example. The prophet Isaiah, he quotes sacred scripture. Above we saw he quotes St. Paul's second epistle to St. Timothy. These are the sources that St. Thomas draws from. And they're important because we see what he's reading, what he's studying, and where he's drawing his answers from, which tells us what we should be studying and what we should be using to draw our answers from. Okay? Let's keep reading. The end must first be known by men who are to direct their thoughts and actions to that end. Hence it was necessary. Notice the word hence means therefore, comes after another reason. He says here, the end must be known by men. There's another starting principle. We have to know the end in order to direct our thoughts and actions to it. We can't know that end by philosophy alone, and therefore there's a necessity for divine revelation. Hence, it was necessary for the salvation of man that certain truths which exceed human reason should be made known to him by divine revelation. Okay? Even as regards those truths about God which human reason could have discovered, it was necessary that man should be taught by a divine revelation because, so here we have the introduction of another reason, because the truth about God, such as reason could discover, would only be known by a few, and that after a long time and with the admixture of many errors. It would be an imperfect knowledge, it would be known only to a few, and it would take a long time for those few to discover. Whereas man's whole salvation, which is in God, depends upon the knowledge of this truth. Therefore, in order that the salvation of men might be brought about more fitly and more surely, it was necessary that they should be taught divine truths by divine revelation. It was therefore necessary that besides philosophical science built up by reason, there should be a sacred science learnt through revelation. So we have a restatement of the answer. So as you go through that, we see the answer to the question, but what we're looking for are the reasons why the answers are what they are. How does St. Thomas approach these questions? Where does he draw from in terms of principles to begin the investigation of these questions? That's what we're looking for when we talk about universals. Let's look at another article. Let's look at Article 2, whether sacred doctrine is a science. So here we have the question to be investigated in this article, and we then have St. Thomas's answer down here. I answer that sacred doctrine is a science. You can't get any simpler than that. We must bear in mind that there are two kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from a principle known by the light of natural intelligence, such as arithmetic and geometry. In other words, there are some sciences, like the 7 liberal arts, which are drawn from self-evident truths, okay, like arithmetic and geometry. There are some which proceed from principles known by the light of a higher science. Thus, the science of perspective proceeds from principles established by geometry. Music proceeds from principles established by arithmetic. So there are some sciences that are sort of direct sciences where we work from self-evident truths to establish these primary sciences, and then there are other sciences which are more like secondary sciences, which are based on the assumptions established, I shouldn't say assumptions, based on the conclusions of those primary sciences. So it is that sacred doctrine is a science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, namely the science of God and the blessed. Hence, just as the musician accepts on authority the principles taught him by the mathematician, so sacred science is established on principles revealed by God. Now, I would not say that there is a good and clear universal statement in that answer. So let's just go to the next article. Third article, whether sacred doctrine is one science. St. Thomas says, sacred doctrine is one science. The unity of a faculty or habit is to be judged by its object. there you have a good example of a universal. Okay, so he takes this general principle that's assumed to be true, and he uses that as the starting point for his investigation, the beginning of his reasoning, all right? The unity of a faculty or habit is to be gauged by its object. He then goes on to say, for example, man, ass, stone agree in one precise formality of being colored, and color is the formal object of sight. Therefore, because sacred scripture considers things precisely under the formality of being divinely revealed, whatever has been divinely revealed possesses the one precise formality of the object of this science, and therefore is included under sacred doctrine as under one science. We have St. Thomas's answer, and we have that principle where his answer begins. The unity of a faculty or habit is to be gauged by its object. Whether a science is one, as we ask here, whether a science is one is determined by whether its object is one. That's the principle. He then asks, well, with respect to sacred doctrine or theology, does it have one object? The answer is yes. Sacred doctrine has one object. Therefore, sacred doctrine is one science. So you can see how the syllogisms in St. Thomas's writings are established and how they come from this beginning principle, which is his method for answering these questions. And that's why we're looking for this. We want to learn how to answer questions the way St. Thomas does. So remember, it's understood that you're just getting started in this study. When you submit your assignments, what I'm looking for in grading your assignments is not some kind of profound mastery of the subject. I'm looking to see development in your study. I'm looking to see that you're beginning to understand how to study the Summa Theologica. I'm looking to see that you're beginning lesson by lesson to understand and identify these things more and more as you go. So don't stress too much. I know you haven't studied this. I know you're not an expert, and that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to understand and learn these concepts, not just of the content of the Summa Theologica, but of how to study it. And not only how to study it, but how to actually think and answer questions like St. Thomas Aquinas, who is our model here in scholastic philosophy. Okay, so I hope that's a helpful explanation of what we're looking for with respect to these universals. If you have any questions, let me know, and let me propose another option. If you would like to study this together, if you'd like to join me for live classes, just let me know, because I can arrange a live class meeting during the week, and we can study through the Summa Theologica together. So if you think that would be helpful, just let me know, and we'll get that set up. I hope that's helpful. God bless.